When you've been chasing someone who seems to always run, there comes a point where exhaustion overtakes your determination. You feel drained, like you've given everything, only to find yourself standing in front of a wall that doesn't respond, doesn't break, doesn't bend. So you stop. And in that silence, an uncomfortable question begins to haunt you. What do they really want? What could possibly break through that wall without you throwing yourself against it? What is it they're secretly longing to hear when you finally decide to pull back? The truth is that most people misread the avoidant. They mistake their distance for coldness, their silence for hatred, their detachment for an absence of feeling. But that's not what's really happening beneath the surface. The avoidant is not without emotion. They are overwhelmed by it. They are not indifferent. They are afraid of what closeness will do to them, of what intimacy will demand from them. And the paradox is that while they recoil from pursuit, they quietly hope for connection. They want love, but they want it in a way that does not consume them. They want to be seen, but not suffocated. And so the moment you stop chasing, a shift happens in the balance of power. It's as if they suddenly realize the silence that once felt like safety is now echoing with the possibility of permanent loss. To understand what they secretly want, you must first understand how their mind has been shaped. People don't become avoidant because they're cruel. They become avoidant because somewhere along the way, closeness felt dangerous. As children, many avoidants learned that their emotional needs would not be met. But when they reached out, the hand they were looking for was not there. Maybe their parents were absent. Maybe they were cold. Maybe they punished vulnerability instead of rewarding it. The child learns very early that to need is to risk disappointment. And so they build walls. Those walls follow them into adulthood, into romance, into friendships, into every corner of their life. So when you pursue an avoidant with all your might, when you send messages over and over, when you plead for clarity, when you try to force a confrontation, you're not showing them love in a language they understand. You're confirming the story they've been telling themselves since childhood. Closeness is pressure, intimacy is suffocation, and the only way to survive is to retreat. Every step you take toward them feels like a demand they cannot meet. It activates the deepest fear inside them, the fear that they will never be enough, that love is a trap they'll fail at, that they will once again be swallowed by someone else's expectations. That's why chasing backfires. It doesn't bring them closer. It drives them deeper into retreat. It doesn't reassure them. It convinces them they were right to run. And that's where most people fail in these dynamics. They don't realize that silence is not just absence. Silence can be presence too. When you stop chasing, you're not abandoning them. You're creating the space where they can feel safe enough to come forward. You're breaking the cycle that keeps proving their fears right. And here's the strange, almost counterintuitive truth. When you stop chasing, the avoidant begins to think about you in a different way. Your silence is not ignored. It is noticed. It is felt. But not as rejection. It is felt as a test of strength. They begin to wonder, why aren't you flooding them with pressure anymore? Why aren't you begging for scraps of attention? Why aren't you demanding they play a role they feel they can't play? And that wonder slowly turns into curiosity. They begin to realize that maybe, just maybe, you're different. You're not like the others who drown them in demands. You're not going to disappear into neediness. You're showing them something rare, the ability to care without clinging, to love without suffocating, to stand strong in your own self without requiring them to fill the emptiness inside you. This is the paradox of the avoidant. They fear closeness but secretly want it. They recoil from pursuit but secretly long to be chosen. And when you stop chasing, you ignite the only dynamic that can shift their defenses. They start asking questions they would never admit out loud. Do they still care about me? Do I matter enough for them to still be there? What happens if I lose them completely? The silence begins to work on them like water on stone. It wears down their resistance without force, without violence, without pleading. It makes them feel the one thing they avoid at all costs, vulnerability. But notice, this is not manipulation. This isn't a game. It's a rebalancing of energies. Because the truth is, if you're chasing, you've already given up your ground. You've already signaled that you will abandon yourself for the sake of their attention. And that is the quickest way to destroy attraction. What the avoidant needs to feel, though they'd never tell you outright, is that you respect yourself enough to not collapse into their silence. They need to feel that you're capable of walking away, that you're whole without them, that you can live your life fully. whether they're standing next to you or not. And when you hold that position, when you step back with dignity instead of desperation, you are unconsciously telling them the one thing they've been starving to hear since childhood: I will not consume you. I will not smother you. I am here, but I do not need to break you to love you. That message is not spoken in words alone. It's spoken in your restraint, in your silence, in your refusal to let their distance unravel you. Now imagine the psychology inside the avoidance mind at this point. For years, maybe for decades, they've lived with a script that says, if I let someone too close, I'll lose myself. If I trust love, it will betray me. If I show need, I'll be abandoned. That script has protected them, but it's also imprisoned them. They long for love like anyone else, but every time it approaches, they run. When you stop chasing, you disrupt that script. You create a space they've never known before. One where intimacy does not equal suffocation, where love does not equal demand, where connection does not require self-erasure. And in that space, something begins to shift. The avoidant, for the first time, begins to associate you not with pressure, but with freedom. And paradoxically, that's when they feel the pull, because human beings are not designed to live cut off from love. Even the most avoidant, the most withdrawn, the most defended, deep down they want to be seen, understood, accepted. What they don't want is to be trapped. So the moment you stop chasing, you start embodying the one thing they crave most, a connection that doesn't cage them. But here's the danger. Many people break this dynamic too soon. They get nervous in the silence, they feel the pull of anxiety, and they cave. They send a long message, they plead for answers, they demand clarity, and in doing so, they reset the cycle. The avoidant breathes a sigh of relief because their old story is confirmed again. See, closeness is pressure. I knew it. That's why you must understand on a deep level that silence is not a void. It's a statement. It's a declaration of strength. And if you can hold that line, the avoidant will eventually come forward because now, for the first time, they see you as someone safe. And it is in that moment when they begin to edge closer that the question arises, what do you say? What words do you give them that reassure them without pulling them back into fear? What do they secretly want to hear but will never ask for outright? That's where the real power lies. Not in chasing, not in silence alone, but in learning the language that tells them, I see you, I value you, and I do not need to own you to love you. There is always a moment where the dynamic changes, and it's rarely the moment you expect. You think silence will end everything, that walking away will erase your chances, that by no longer chasing you've closed the door forever. But the reality is often the opposite. The turning point is not in how desperately you pursue, but in how firmly you stand still. It's in the shift where you stop proving your worth and start living it. And this shift unsettles the avoidant more than anything else. When you withdraw from the chase, you interrupt their cycle. You take away the predictability that they've built their defenses on. Up until now, they've been certain of how the game is played. You reach, they retreat, you cry, they go silent, you chase, they hide. It's a dance they know well. And in some ways, it gives them comfort. But when you step out of that dance, the rhythm changes. You create silence where noise used to be. You create space where pressure used to close in. And suddenly they are faced with something unfamiliar, your absence, not as rejection, but as self-possession. This unsettles them because for perhaps the first time, they feel the weight of your value. They feel the gravity of your presence, not through your chasing, but through your stillness. They notice the absence, and instead of relief, it brings them unease. They start asking questions they've avoided for years. Why aren't you trying anymore? Did they stop caring? Were they stronger than I thought? And beneath those questions, a deeper one, what happens if I lose them completely? The avoidance instinct has always been to run from pressure, but when the pressure is gone, their instinct changes. They no longer feel hunted. Instead, they feel a subtle pull toward you. Not because you're manipulating, not because you're playing games, but because the dynamic is no longer threatening. They're free to think about you without fear of being cornered. They're free to reflect on what you meant without drowning in expectations. And in that freedom, curiosity grows. But make no mistake, this is not an instant transformation. Avoidants don't swing like a pendulum, rushing back the moment you let go. What happens is more subtle. It begins with thoughts they don't share. They replay memories. They recall moments where they felt safe with you, where your presence calmed rather than consumed them. They wonder what you're doing now, who you're talking to, if you've moved on, and slowly what once felt like relief in your silence begins to feel like risk, because for the first time, the possibility of losing you feels real. And avoidance, for all their fear of closeness, fear that loss just as deeply. Now comes the critical question. When they start edging closer, when they test the waters with a message, a call, a subtle attempt to reconnect, what do you give them? What do they secretly want to hear, but will never ask for directly? It's not desperation. It's not a flood of pent-up emotions. It's not the speech that says, I've been waiting, I'll do anything, please don't leave me. Those words triggered the very fears that drove them away in the first place. They remind the avoidant of everything they've been running from. To them, those words translate as pressure, demand, loss of freedom, and nothing drives them back into their shell faster. What they secretly want to hear is something far more subtle, far more balanced. They want to hear words that affirm your independence while leaving the door open to connection. They want to hear calm, steady reassurance without the weight of expectation. They want to feel that you see them not as a savior, not as a rescuer of your loneliness, but as a human being you appreciate without needing to cage. Think of it like this. The avoidant has spent their life convinced that intimacy means losing themselves. They fear being swallowed whole by someone else's needs. So the words that penetrate their defenses must carry the opposite message. They must say, I see you, I value you, but I don't need to consume you to love you. That is the paradoxical balm they crave, connection without captivity. It might sound something like this: I care about you, but I'm good where I am too, where I enjoy our connection, but I respect your space. Or even something as simple as, I'm here if you want to talk. Do you notice the tone? It's calm, it's light, it's without demand. It offers presence without pressure, care without control. Why do these words matter so much? Because they rewrite the avoidant story. They whisper a truth they've been waiting to believe since they were children. That someone can love them without trapping them, that someone can stay without suffocating them. And the irony is, it's not the grand declarations that change them, it's the simplicity. It's the fact that you can communicate interest without losing your ground, that you can be open without being desperate, that you can give them the gift of freedom while still offering connection. But here's where most people go wrong. They underestimate the power of simplicity. They think they need to break through the avoidance defenses with intensity, with emotion, with explanation. They send long paragraphs. They pour out years of frustration. They try to convince the avoidant of their loyalty. And every word of it backfires because it sounds like demand, like pressure, like entrapment. The avoidant doesn't hear love in those words. They hear danger. So what the avoidant secretly wants to hear is not a flood, but a drop of reassurance, a drop of calm, a drop of presence, enough to remind them that connection is possible without danger, enough to show them that you won't collapse into them, but you also won't vanish completely. It is this delicate balance between warmth and independence that pulls them in. And when you master this balance, something powerful happens. The avoidant begins to feel safe enough to step closer. They begin to test trust in small ways by sharing a little more, by reaching out a little sooner, by allowing themselves to lean into the connection instead of running from it. And it is in those small steps that transformation begins. But remember, it is not your job to heal them. It is not your job to break their walls or fix their wounds. It is your job to stand firmly in your own strength, to communicate from a place of security rather than need, because the words they secretly long to hear are not just about them, they're about you. They reveal whether you've built your own foundation, whether you've learned to love without losing yourself, whether you can offer presence without demand. And if you can do that, you will embody the very thing they've been searching for in silence. Someone who doesn't just chase them, but someone who can walk beside them freely, securely, without fear. When you begin to see the shift, when the avoidant leans ever so slightly toward you, the temptation is to believe you've cracked some hidden code. But it isn't magic and it isn't manipulation. It works because you've aligned yourself with something that's true about human nature, something far older and deeper than attachment styles or modern psychology. It works because you've finally touched the balance between freedom and connection. Think about what it means to be human. On one hand, we crave union. We long for closeness, for the embrace of someone who knows us fully and accepts us anyway. But on the other hand, we fear dissolution. We fear losing ourselves in the crowd, in the relationship, in the demands of another person's expectations. It's the same paradox you see in myths and ancient stories. The hero ventures into the unknown, but if he loses his identity in the process, he's devoured. To love and be loved is to risk that devouring, and so every human being carries a deep ambivalence about intimacy. Now magnify that tension 100-fold, and you have the avoidant. For them, the fear of being consumed overwhelms the longing for connection. Their nervous system reads intimacy not as comfort, but as threat. So when you speak to them in the old ways, when you plead, when you demand, when you smother, you're not speaking the language of love to them. You're speaking the language of danger. You're confirming the exact fear they're trying to escape. This is why the right words matter. When you say something calm, grounded, non-demanding, you bypass their defenses. You don't trigger their old story, you write a new one. Instead of closeness equals suffocation, the new story becomes closeness can coexist with freedom. And this shift doesn't just feel pleasant, it feels revolutionary to them. It's as if for the first time, someone is offering them a connection that doesn't require betrayal of the self. That's why those words sink deep. Because they're not heavy with pressure, they're light with possibility. They don't trap, they invite. They don't smother, they breathe. And in that breathing space, the avoidant feels something they rarely feel in relationships, safety to move closer, to share, to risk vulnerability without fearing the cage will close around them. And here's the deeper layer. The avoidant doesn't consciously know this is what they want. They won't articulate it. They won't say, please reassure me with independence, not pressure. They're not aware of the paradox they're living. But their nervous system knows, their body knows, their heart knows. When they hear those words, when they sense that calmness in your presence, something in them exhales. They don't even fully understand why. They only know that for once, closeness doesn't feel like a trap. This is also why silence, followed by carefully chosen words, is so powerful. Silence shows strength. It shows you won't collapse into neediness. Then when you finally do speak, the words carry weight. They aren't drowned in desperation. They're carried by restraint. They strike at the avoidant's deepest longing because they've been waiting in the space created by your stillness. It's like water to the thirsty. Not because you flooded them, but because you gave them just enough at the right time in the right way. But let me warn you, most people sabotage this balance. They don't trust simplicity. They think they need to say more, to explain, to convince. They add weight where weight destroys. And in doing so, they push the avoidant back into the very corner they just left. The most common mistake is over-explaining. You feel the need to justify your silence, to give them a history lesson in your pain, to pour every emotion onto their shoulders. But to the avoidant, this isn't healing, it's pressure. They don't hear, I want to be understood. They hear, here are more demands I'll never live up to. And so they retreat. Another mistake is guilt tripping. You might think you're appealing to their conscience, reminding them of how much you gave, how much you suffered, how much they owe you. But guilt is poison to the avoidant. It doesn't draw them closer, it drives them away. Because guilt feels like another trap, another way of being bound, another leash around their neck. If you want to see an avoidant disappear, start making them feel responsible for your happiness. They'll run and they won't look back. The third mistake is begging for clarity. You want answers, you want labels, you want closure, and so you push them to define what they cannot define, to promise what they are terrified to promise. In your world, clarity feels like safety. In their world, clarity feels like confinement. And so your insistence on certainty backfires. They pull away even harder, not because they don't care, but because the demand feels like suffocation. And perhaps the most tragic mistake of all is losing yourself in the process. You wait, you bend, you compromise until there's nothing left of your own identity. You think this will make them stay, but it only confirms their worst fear, that love means losing oneself. If you want to embody the message they secretly long for, you must remain anchored in who you are, your strength, your independence, your wholeness. That's what makes your words believable. That's what makes your presence safe. So understand this. The avoidant doesn't need you to be perfect. They don't need you to be endlessly patient or eternally available. They don't need you to sacrifice your dignity to keep the connection alive. What they need, though they'd never say it out loud, is to feel that you can stand beside them without collapsing into them. They need to feel that you see them as valuable, but not as the air you breathe. They need to feel that they are chosen, not clung to. And when you give them that through silence, through restraint, through words that affirm rather than demand, you create the conditions for love to grow. Not the fragile love that collapses under pressure, but the steady love that endures because it honors freedom as much as intimacy. That's the love avoidants secretly long for. That's the love that rewrites their old story. That's the love that, once given, they will quietly cherish even if they don't yet have the courage to say it. When the dynamic shifts, it's not just the avoidant who changes, you change too. And that is the real transformation, because relationships in the end are mirrors. What you tolerate, what you pursue, what you demand, all of it reflects not only who they are, but who you are. The avoidant begins to lean closer, not because you found the right trick, but because you discovered the right posture. You stopped living as if your worth depended on their response, and in doing so, you reclaimed yourself. Now think about what that does to the relationship dynamic. At first, the avoidant held the power. They were the ones retreating, controlling the distance, dictating the terms. You, in chasing, confirmed that imbalance. But when you stopped, you shifted the ground beneath them. You said, without words, I am not here to beg. I am not here to collapse into you. I am whole. And I will not betray that wholeness for the illusion of closeness. That declaration, silent though it may be, forces the avoidant to see you differently. And it's in that moment they begin to chase, not always in dramatic ways, not always with grand gestures. Sometimes it's subtle, almost imperceptible at first. They send a text that feels casual but carries weight. They ask about your life, your plans, your thoughts, as if testing whether you're still available. They edge into conversations they once avoided. Slowly, the current begins to reverse. And the reason is not because you played hard to get, it's because you embodied strength, and strength draws people in. That is the irony of human connection. We are not pulled toward weakness. We are pulled toward vitality. We are drawn to those who radiate self-respect, who do not crumble under silence, who can carry their own weight without demanding someone else carry it for them. This is why your restraint, your calm, your carefully chosen words shift everything. Because you are no longer chasing from a place of emptiness, you are inviting from a place of fullness. And the avoidant who has spent their life fleeing pressure finally encounters something they didn't know they were looking for: stability. When you become that stable presence, the avoidant no longer sees intimacy as a threat. They begin to experience it as something different, something they may have never known before, a connection that doesn't require the sacrifice of self. This is the essence of secure love. Two people standing side by side, whole in themselves, free yet connected, strong yet open. And for the avoidant, this is revolutionary. It challenges the very foundation of the story they've been living. It says, maybe closeness isn't suffocation. Maybe love doesn't mean losing myself. Maybe I can be seen and still remain intact. Now, this doesn't mean the avoidant will suddenly become secure overnight. Old patterns don't dissolve so easily. They may still pull away at times. They may still retreat into silence when things get too intense. But the difference is that the dynamic has changed. Your silence no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like steadiness. Your words no longer feel like pressure. They feel like reassurance. And in that environment, they slowly begin to trust themselves, trust you, trust that intimacy might not be the trap they've always believed. And what does this mean for you? It means you no longer live as a beggar of love. You no longer sacrifice your dignity on the altar of someone else's fear. You no longer define your worth by whether or not the avoidant validates you in the moment. You stand firm in who you are, and from that ground, you invite others into connection. Some will accept, some will not, but either way, you remain whole. That is freedom. That is strength. That is the foundation of every healthy bond. And so the real gift in all of this is not simply learning what avoidants secretly want to hear, it's learning who you must become in order to say it. It's not about memorizing a script of perfect phrases. It's about embodying the calm confidence that makes those phrases true, because words without authenticity fall flat. You can say, I respect your space, but if deep down you're drowning in anxiety, the avoidant will feel the pressure anyway. You can say, I'm here if you want to talk, but if your entire life revolves around waiting for their message, they'll sense the trap. The power is not in the words alone. The power is in the alignment between your words and your reality. So the question is not only what do avoidants secretly want to hear, the deeper question is, are you willing to become the kind of person who can speak those words with truth? Are you willing to build a life so rooted in strength, so anchored in purpose, that you can love without clutching, give without losing, connect without collapsing? Because when you reach that place, the avoidant is no longer a puzzle to be solved. They're simply another human being, wrestling with their own fears, drawn toward the stability you embody. This is the paradox. You went searching for the secret phrase that would unlock their heart, but what you found instead is that the secret phrase is nothing without the secret posture. It is not about chasing. It is not about pleading. It is not even about silence for the sake of silence. It is about becoming whole and letting that wholeness speak for you. And that is where I leave you, not with a game to play, not with a tactic to manipulate, but with a challenge. Build yourself into someone whose presence says what no words ever could. I am strong. I am whole. I can love without fear. Speak with calmness. Act with dignity. Live with purpose. Then and only then will the avoidant hear what they've been longing for all along. That love can be chosen, not chased. That connection can be free, not forced. That intimacy can exist without captivity. So if you're listening right now and you've been exhausted by the chase, let this be your moment of clarity. Stop running after what flees. Stand still, stand tall, let silence do its work, let strength be your language, let your words be few but steady. And when the avoidant finally edges close enough to listen,